In this video I'm going to be showing you all you need to know about the JOYO Bantamp bass head. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel once again. If you're new around here, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. So in this video, as I said, I'm going to be reviewing this, which is the Bantamp bass head from JOYO. The model is the Badass, and this is their small Bantamp range of heads. As you might have seen, they're quite a prolific seller on Amazon and other retailers, and they've done loads of heads for guitars, and this is their bass head version of that little Bantamp style head. If you haven't seen it already, I did an unboxing video of this head and you can find it on the channel. I'll also link it above me and in the description below, and that'll give you an idea of what you can expect already, my initial impressions from this head. In that unboxing video I spoke about the different ins and outs on the unit, and just a quick overview of those now. We have an input here on the front of the unit, send and return on the back, which I'll have a look at in a little bit. Next you have a foot switch in and out that can be controlled here, which is used to control the compressor, and this foot switch comes with the unit, and a cable as well to run into that. There's a headphones out, so that takes a 1/4 inch jack like this, so it will require you to have one of these if you're using mini jack headphones, just to adapt it so it's the right size. But if you work a lot in audio anyway, you're probably going to have one of these around in a drawer somewhere, unless someone's borrowed it and never returned it, which happens a lot too. After that we have a 4 ohm speaker out, so that's the minimum load is 4 ohms. If you have this head running at 4 ohms, you're going to get the full 50 watts out of it. If you have higher resistance loads, so 8 ohms, 16 ohms, you won't get the full 50 watts power, as that resistance will soak up some of those watts. But you can't run it with anything lower than 4. Anything that's 4 ohms, you can't have 2 of them. So if you've got one 4 ohm cab, that's all you can use with this. But most bass cabs are going to be 8 ohm. Out of shot here on camera, I've got 2 Aguilar SL112 cabs running to get that full 50 watts out of the head. Some of the other features you're going to find on this head are a 3-band EQ, so it's a low, mid and high, typical standard EQ, which works in kind of, to me, like a Baxendale style. It's quite broad and quite easy. It's a lot like a Fender style EQ. It doesn't do a lot, but it kind of means you can't really destroy your sound with it either. We then have the compression. As I've mentioned, that's a 1 knob compressor, so this is probably just setting the threshold really, and then saying whether that compression kicks in or not, and at what level it does so. A gain knob, which does saturate the signal, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. I did it a little bit in the unboxing video, you can hear it quite clearly. And that is using the 112AX7 tube in the head in order to add those additional harmonics, that saturation, that gain. And the final control we have is just the volume knob, which is pretty self-explanatory. It controls the volume level of the bass out of this head. When it comes to the Bluetooth functionality, it's definitely showing that this amp is probably more aimed towards the practice market, towards being very practical to use at home and making things very easy, and it definitely does achieve that. In terms of operation, it's very simple. You simply switch on the Bluetooth. You then go to your device, so in this instance I used an iPad. I simply unlocked the iPad, headed to the Bluetooth settings. The Badass came up as a setting on the device. I clicked it, and within a few seconds it was connected. One thing I wasn't sure whether it would do or not was to play the sound back through the speakers, and it does, which is quite useful, particularly in practice situations. A lot of the time in a rehearsal, someone might want to reference a track, might want to reference the recording that you've already done of a track as a band or something, and that does make it quite a little useful tool. If you were to run this through any more kind of full range speaker, you get a really quite clear PA type sound. Running it through bass cabs, they're kind of like PA cabs, but they're kind of voiced to have a bit more low end, and that's definitely the case. So what I'm going to show you in a second is just the sound of the Bluetooth playing a track back through. In terms of how the volume and things work, the volume knob on the amp controls just the volume of the bass. So if you've got your bass plugged in and you're playing along to a track, this volume knob will only change the volume of the bass. The volume of the track is controlled by the iPad, or whatever device you've connected to it. So you'll just turn it up on the device, and that will bring up the sound out of your speaker cabs. And that's also the same when you're wearing headphones. Personally, I'd use it for the majority of the time with headphones. I think it makes it really useful as a practice tool. I think a lot of our devices now don't have any way of outputting a headphone signal, so you're going to be relying on adapters, typically a USB-C adapter. So having the Bluetooth built into the head is really useful. I know back in my very early formative days, kind of age 13 or whatever, I would carry around a little lead and it would go into the front of an Ibanez combo amp I had, and that would then send the signal out and be used to share things with my bandmates when I was really young. So this is really the modern alternative to that, now that we don't have headphone jacks typically anymore. And it works really well. It sounds better on the headphones. There's a little bit of distortion if you crank it right up. There's a little bit of top end distortion, but this actually drove my Beyerdynamic 880 Pros quite well, which are a high impedance headphone. So typically you wouldn't expect to get too much volume out of them. And it drove them to a nice healthy volume, a volume where I actually wanted to turn it down a little bit. The cab is mic'd up with a Warm Audio 47 Junior mic. I'm going to play you a little bit of a track just to give you an idea of how it might sound coming out of your bass cab, and give you an idea of whether that's useful or not to you. And I'm only going to play you a tiny snippet because I don't want to get a copyright strike. None of the controls on the amp control anything that I'm playing right now. So the EQ won't affect it, the gain won't affect it, and the compressor and volume definitely won't affect it either. So I think generally pretty acceptable, particularly just to give a representation. One quite useful thing I found with these Aguilar cabs paired with it is it does accentuate the bass. So if you want to get a bit of a better idea of, a bass part on a track, it will help that stand out just that extra little bit more and help you learn a part. So now I've run through the Bluetooth features, which were one of the pretty much mysterious features to me and something that I didn't understand when I was doing the unboxing video. I've shown that I think it's probably best suited to someone who's just learning as a practice amp, but it's also a useful tool to have integrated into your amp, and it shows you exactly what it does. Now I'm going to run you through the EQ on this amp, talk about all of the knobs and show you them in real detail and let you hear exactly what each of them is doing. As I said a moment ago, this is mic'd up with a Warm Audio 47 Junior mic. It's going into my Universal Audio Twin X converter, and you'll be hearing it just straight back out of that system. I got it turned up to about just under 50%, and really for a room this size, that's pretty much perfect for me. That's running 2 cabs, don't forget. And I'll talk about things like volume, I'll talk about who I think this is suited to at the end of this video, so stick around for that. But yeah, for now we're going to dive into the EQ. As I'm running through these settings, I'm going to be just tweaking away. I've got a loop set up, so in a kind of Blue Peter way, I've got a loop that I prepared earlier, and I will just be able to really just dial in the different settings and allow you to hear them. In terms of the gain and the volume, I'm going to be tweaking those so that the gain, you're just hearing the saturation and not so much the volume boost as well. And hopefully that will allow you to really get a good evaluation of the sound of this amp. So when it comes to the controls, I think what I could hear there is that the low end, it doesn't suffer too much when you roll it out, but by the time you get to the very end of the knob, you do probably need a little bit more low end back into your signal. I think with the mid-range, you can really change the shape of that tone. It's not dramatic, but it's enough that you notice it. When you suck it all the way out, it does smooth out, it does scoop out a little bit. You can hear that. It sounds scooped to me. The bass gets a little bit bigger and the top end's a little bit clearer, but it's not a harshness in the mid-range. When you do boost that mid-range back up, it becomes more present, it adds a little bit more punch, a little bit more thickness in the centre of the tone. A slight ugliness on its own, but something that's going to help a lot in the mix. And then with the treble control, it's again not dramatic. It's a lot like the low end control. You're going to get more brightness, a little bit more top end, a little bit more cut. But when you roll it off, it does get a little bit darker, but it's not super dark. I think that's one of the things that I mentioned in the unboxing videos, that with these controls, you can never really go wrong. They can't really damage your signal too much. What you get is really a tone that is going to be usable no matter what you're doing. And I think particularly if we're aiming this at someone more like a learner or someone starting out, someone that's in their development stages, or someone who wants to practice at home, that's something that's really nice about this amp. You just plug it in and you go, and no matter where the knobs are situated, you're not really going to do too much harm. When it comes to the compressor, that definitely adds some volume no matter what it's doing, and even when it's, you know, just engaged but pretty low down, there's definitely a slight thickening to the sound overall. A little bit more of a boost in volume, that definitely happens as well. And as you turn it up, for me, you know, in this kind of range here, it's really comfortable and it's quite nice. And you get used to it. I much prefer my sound in general with a little bit of compression, no matter what I'm doing. But once you start getting into this kind of territory up here, for someone that's maybe a little bit uneven in their technique, it might be, you know, a bit of a safety blanket and help out a little bit. But in general, up here, it starts to feel too squished to me. It starts to feel unnatural. It starts to feel like the transient at the start of the note disappears, and you just get this kind of very consistent block, no matter what you're doing. And at that point, I start to lose the joy and the body in my sound. One thing I wanted to highlight was the gain knob, because it's something that was mentioned in the unboxing video in the comments about how much it's doing. Obviously, it's driving that 12AX7 tube, and that does give some saturation and harmonic content to it. I personally like it kind of around here, so an idea of that. I roll that back out, it's clean. You can tell there's a bit of a boost there. It definitely adds a bit of fatness, and that's the nature of harmonics and distortion. When it's done lightly, it's going to be able to make your sound better heard. It's going to fatten everything up and just make everything feel a bit bigger. And it will go more gnarly, more distorted than that. So turning it up a little bit more. You can hear there as I dig in a little bit with the right hand, you get a little bit more of that distortion on the attack. And then turn it up even more. And then turn it up to full. So there you go, as you can hear, it's kind of quite a warm sounding saturation. It's definitely not too dark to my ears, but I mean, the more gain you push into it, the more it distorts, and it does brighten up if you add even more. So something like a preamp pedal, if you want to push that into the front of it, it's going to give it more gain. But I mean, overall, I probably wouldn't be driving this too hard. What I would be doing is kind of leaving the game where I said I liked it earlier, somewhere around this region here. That adds a nice fatness and saturation to your sound, but doesn't overdrive it, doesn't push it too hard. And that's going to help you just enjoy your practice. It's not going to sound too sterile, it's not going to sound too boring. It's going to give you all of those things that make something sound really pleasant to the ear, those old school traditional tones. It's going to make those happen without pushing it into distortion and pushing it into, you know, clipping and things that maybe we don't necessarily want as much nowadays in terms of our tone, unless you're going for a particular rock type sound. Last thing I'm going to do is to run the preamp out of the Helix. So I'm going to put a preamp model on it and run it into the return of this amp and see whether this amp could handle duty as, say, a small power amp on a pedal board. So I've now got the Helix plugged in into the effects return. I'm running the G Cougar 800 model, which is the Gay & Kruger model on the Helix, and it makes quite an obvious difference to my ears. When you're in this mode, it runs, well, none of the controls on the front are active when you're running in this mode. So you control the volume of the entire unit, the entire output from the head is controlled by whatever you put in front. So your preamp pedal, in this instance the Helix, so the main volume knob controls that. But it does a really good job. It isn't adding its own character at all. It just sounds like a really solid power amp powering these speakers, and it's not colouring it in its own way whatsoever. It just sounds like the model from the Helix straight out of the speakers. So it could be a really good option for that, particularly given its size. And if you're using it as a backup with something like a Helix, if you need an amp occasionally just to hear yourself on stage, maybe you've got a spare little cab around that you just want to pop on a small stand to hear yourself, this could be a good option potentially. So now you've seen what this amp can do, you've seen the features, you've heard what it can do. I'm going to just give you some of my thoughts and some of the things I've been thinking about before doing this little conclusion and wrap up. As you can see, it's obviously a tiny amp, and typically the JOYO Bantamp range have been emulations, copies of bigger amps in a smaller hybrid enclosure and type of setting. And I do wonder with the AD, as you can see there, being highlighted on the front of the amp, whether this is really kind of an orange tribute. And the reason I say that is just because of the way the controls work, the way that the 12AX7 breaks up a little bit. I think this may be their kind of take on the 8200 or just the orange vibe in general. The EQ doesn't do a lot, and that's what I've experienced on the 8200 and the Terabase heads. They're very similar. They don't really do that. They don't really do much, to be honest, and that's why I moved one on many years ago. Obviously, it's got the compression, which is not really from that. It's an addition, and it's something that's, you know, on others in the Bantamp range in general. And that's just kind of my takeaway from this, is that maybe this is really their orange take. It's not specifically or explicitly said, but if you like that kind of tone, this is definitely going to get you in that ballpark. And again, with your own stuff, you can't really go wrong. It kind of just sounds like it sounds, and you can adjust it a bit. So that was one of the things I was just pondering. But in general, I think this amp is pretty good. It sounds pretty good for my tastes. I like the sound of it. I like the clean sound of it. I like that little bit of saturation that you get from the gain knob turned up, just fattens everything out a little bit. I think that tube actually does go to good work in an amp like this. And I think it's more so because the power amp section is actually quite small and isn't super loud. It means that you can turn it up enough and you can turn the gain up and you actually can hear the texture of it, rather than it just completely overpowering and blowing everything up. You really do get a sense of the colour and the saturation from that gain knob. In the online documentation for this amp, JOYO talks about it being used for small gigs, practice and rehearsals. I think depending on what you do, it could definitely fit into 1, 2 or maybe all 3 of those categories, depending on your genre and your style. I think for rehearsal it probably has you covered no matter what you're doing. It's too loud at home with 2 cabs if you cranked it all the way up. But as soon as you take that out of a small room like this and put it into a rehearsal space with other guitar amps, this isn't going to last long, particularly if you're playing in a slightly heavier genre. And I typically want a bit more headroom in the rehearsal room. Often rehearsals end up being louder than gigs, I find, and you can't have that level of on-stage volume, but in a rehearsal room you just enjoy yourself and it gets a bit loud, it gets a bit raucous, and this isn't going to keep up with that. Small gigs, I can see it having a good place if you're doing little gigs in a bar, little jazz trio gigs, reinforcing double bass perhaps, though it doesn't have the necessarily correct input resistance for that, but there are options. It could do a good job of that. and it may even fit and tuck away in the front of your double bass case. I think it would fit in mine, to be honest. But I think that is kind of its limitation. It's got to only go that far. It doesn't have an output on the back of it that isn't the speaker output, and I think that is a little bit of a weakness of this head, particularly for bass players. But guitar players, they want to stick a mic in front of it. They don't want a direct out, really. Very rarely or very seldom do you want a direct out guitar signal. And if you do, you then want it to have amp simulation on it. You want it to be low passed and high passed so that it sounds a bit more like a speaker. Whereas bass players, we really do want that. That's something that we typically want on every head we use, because that's our way of recording, that's our way of monitoring ourselves at gigs and sending out to the front of house. And so I think that is a little bit of a missing feature and an oversight for this as a small gigging amp. I mean, if it had that, I mean, you could use this for any gig pretty much, because you'd be hearing the direct sound out, and you just put your monitor as close and as high up to your ear as possible, and then there you go, that's your little baby monitoring rig for you, and everybody else can hear you in the floor wedges, hear you through the PA, hear you through the subs out front or whatever. But I think in general, if you're talking small jazz gigs, this could definitely do it. Outside of that, I probably would give it a miss for gigging in general. I think it really does shine as a rehearsal amp. And the Bluetooth feature is a really nice touch and makes it very convenient for you if you're using, a modern iPhone, a modern Samsung device, any modern phone to get your music across to it. Even new Macs and devices like that, where you don't have to run a cable over to them. You just hit play on your iTunes and it'll come straight back out through this amplifier. At $199, I think it does put itself in a slightly awkward position in terms of it doesn't have its own speaker cabinet. But I think that's really what this head is designed for, is for people that do have speaker cabinets, people that maybe can't run their amp loud at home, and people that want to be able to rehearse really quickly, easily and simply without any faff, without running cables anywhere. And for that, it makes it a really, really useful and quite good value piece of kit. So those are my thoughts overall on this amp. It's not going to set the gigging world alight, but if you're someone who likes to rehearse at home and makes it really easy and simple as possible, then this amp is very much one that you should be checking out and should be on your list. Thank you to JOYO for sending me this head and allowing me to review it. Let me know your thoughts on this head, and also let me know what your practice amp is in the comments below. My Instagram will be linked below me right now, and I will see you in the next video.